This is one of the most hardcore sounds in all classical repertoire. It's what we call a tone cluster, where you essentially play notes very close together. And this is an example from 1738. Les Éléments was written by the French composer Jean-Ferry Ravel and was written to depict the creation of the world. The tone clusters at the beginning of the work represent the chaos of the universe, out of which come 4 motifs, which represent the elements air, water, earth, and of course, fire. Now, for 1738, this is pretty radical music, but the public didn't seem to have a big problem with it. And believe it or not, this is by no means the first time that this sort of thing appears in music history. This is an example from the work Battaglia by the composer Bieber. Oh, no! Heinrich Ignaz Franz Bieber from 1673. It's a programmatic piece about war, and in the example I just showed you, Bieber depicts the soldiers each patriotically singing their own folk songs simultaneously in preparation for the battle, and so he gives each instrument a different melody. But the melodies don't have anything to do with one another. They don't fit together harmonically or rhythmically, they're completely unrelated. But Bieber allows them all to just run together at the same time to create chaos. And it's a common occurrence throughout music history that we see composers completely abandon the laws of harmony in favor of raw artistic expression, or in this case, a sound effect, as is also the case in this example. This is from 1779 by Michel Corrette, and as the title suggests, it's about a navy battle. The clusters are intended to represent the sound of naval cannons. And this isn't the only instance from this time. You can actually find cannon fire being represented in similar ways in other keyboard works from this period as well. In fact, as of this period in history, tone clusters gradually become used more and more frequently as a form of sound effect. And as a sound effect, it's totally understandable why you would use these sorts of sounds. But you do occasionally also find composers using clusters as part of their actual harmonic language. This is a sonata by the composer Domenico Scarlatti, and no, these chords are not intended as effects. This is literally just how he writes music, and if you take a closer look at them, they're pretty wild. These aren't full-blown hardcore clusters like some of the other clusters we've seen, but at the same time, they're not really normal chords either. They're extraordinarily dissonant, and anyone who knows Scarlatti knows that these sorts of chords appear quite regularly throughout his music. The use of tone clusters gradually increases throughout history until we get to the 20th century, where it just explodes, particularly among American composers such as Charles Ives or Henry Cowell. Cowell performed this piece in 1923 in Leipzig, Germany, and it caused an instantaneous riot. People were trying to climb onto the stage, others were throwing things at his face. One particular man got up and shouted, "Halten Sie uns für Idioten in Deutschland!" Yeah, they weren't happy. But despite the occasional pushback from the public, a lot of composers became absolutely fascinated by these types of sounds. There's a lot that you can do with them. You have diatonic clusters, where you use all of the notes of a scale. There are chromatic clusters, where you use all semitones. And also microtonal clusters. The way that you listen to clusters is very different to the way that you listen to harmony. It's about the sound experience. And what the listener hears are the essentially macro elements of the sound. Is it high? Is it low? Is it thin? Is it wide? Composers realized that this was an entire sound world for them to explore. And so in the late 50s, going into the 60s, cluster music becomes almost a genre in and of itself. You have composers like Xenakis, Ligeti, Cheha, Penderecki, all creating massive orchestral cluster compositions. Cluster techniques then also very quickly began to influence the film industry. One of the biggest breakthroughs was with Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey from 1968. Kubrick commissioned the Hollywood composer Alex North to write the soundtrack. And to give North an idea of the soundtrack he was interested in having, Kubrick gave him recordings of Strauss and the cluster compositions of Ligeti for reference. North then composed for the movie, but when it came out, much to his surprise, none of it had been used. Kubrick had just used the original Strauss and Ligeti instead. But Ligeti was equally as surprised because no one told him that they used his cluster music for a blockbuster. Now, if you're curious, I highly recommend checking out the original Alex North Space Odyssey soundtrack. I'll leave a link in the description. It's very different to the soundtrack we're used to, and it gives you a sense of what a dramatic impact a soundtrack can have to the entire vibe of a film. What were we talking about? Clusters! Yeah, clusters are great.